And thank you, everyone who has joined us for this conversation this evening. The topic is at once beautiful, awe-inspiring, and yet deeply frightening. Rainforests, utterly magnificent, and yet dangerously threatened. And you are going to hear some numbers that will leave you sobered in terms of the prospect for the future. Were it not for the leadership of the speakers that we will be featuring in this session, there are some very committed people, knowledgeable, committed, and working together to invite wider publics, including many of us, to get on board with showing our concern for this vital part of the ecological balance of our planet. We're going to go to three speakers here tonight. And so we're a little bit pressed for time, but we really want to reserve enough time at the end of the conversation for questions from the audience. And that's particularly challenging tonight because we have an unusually large number of participants, not unexpected. But if you would like to pose a question, what you do is you go down to the very bottom of the screen that you're looking at, way down to the bottom. The toolbar will open up as you bring your cursor there, and you will see Q&A. Open that link and type your question in, and I will monitor them a little bit later on in the discussion and select questions that I think are most illuminating and most fruitful for us to pursue. But as I said, we have three speakers. They're going to be interacting one way or another with the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which is a integral part of the United Nations Environment Program. Our first speaker is Audrey Kitagawa, who is going to be taking the largest chunk of time, but showing us various resources and opening the discussion with her out of her several decades now of intensive involvement. I mean, her professional life has really been divided into two parts. A top-rated lawyer in Honolulu, Hawaii. But in the last few decades, equally top-level commitment to the United Nations and to other organizations that work at a global, transnational level, and working there, doing the hard work of bringing institutional and governmental consciousness on board to this process. And her particular niche that she brings to all of this is her deep appreciation and connectedness with the spiritual domain of our human existence. Out of that familial spirituality, she comes then to the work of the United Nations, where she is joined by our second speaker, and she's going to introduce our second speaker. This is Dr. Charles Mcneill. She'll say a word about him, but he's certainly one of the foremost experts in the planet on the question of the rainforests. He serves as the senior advisor on forests and climate for the United Nations Environment Program. Absolutely pivotal kind of figure. Again, both working together to transform a deep human spiritual consciousness into institutional and governmental policy and action. So the two of them are going to talk, Audrey first, and then she'll introduce Charles Mcneill. Then we'll pause for a minute. I'll come back on. I'll remind you of the question and answer procedure, and then we'll introduce our main respondent for tonight, Tariq Mustafa, and he'll frame at least one carefully thought through question. We'll bounce that around a little bit, and then we'll open it up. But right now, we are ready to go to our principal speaker, Audrey Kitagawa. Audrey, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. I wish to express my deepest appreciation to the Institute of Religion in the Age of Science for this invitation to present on the vital breath, saving our sacred rainforests. We have all heard about the forest being the lungs of the earth. However, this connection of the earth's lungs to ourselves can seem very remote to our everyday lives, and its intimate connection to us may not be fully appreciated, nor our own understanding of the important nexus between the preservation and existence of the rainforests to our very own survival. Scientists have made it clear that the mass extinction of species that is taking place, the loss of our biodiversity at unprecedented rates, and the destruction of our rainforests are directly attributable to human beings. We have now, therefore, become the world's most dangerous super predators. I want to focus my presentation today on our rainforests and to make that nexus between our survival as inextricably linked to the survival of our rainforests. Further, as I understand that many of the IRAS members are from various religious traditions and are also scientists, I hope to show how religions, through its faith-based communities, can actualize the convergence of science and religion in concrete ways, as will be demonstrated through the United Nations Environment Programme's Interfaith Rainforest Initiative that has joined the science of the rainforests with the integral participation of faith-based organizations in starting a global mobilization to save the rainforests. The Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, or IRI for short, is an international multi-faith alliance working to bring moral urgency and faith-based leadership to global efforts to end tropical deforestation. It is a platform for religious leaders and faith communities to work hand in hand with Indigenous peoples, governments, NGOs, and businesses on actions that protect rainforests and the rights of those that serve as their guardians. The guardians of the rainforest are the Indigenous people. The initiative believes that the time has come for a worldwide movement for the care of tropical forests that is grounded in the inherent value of forests and inspired by the values, ethics, and moral guidance of Indigenous peoples and faith communities. Let's begin by having one of our foremost primatologists and environmentalists share about our rainforests. Let's begin the video.
Rainforests, ecological marvels, millions of years in the making. Rainforests provide water, food, and livelihoods for billions of people around the world. They contain a staggering diversity of life. They create the oxygen we breathe and regulate our climate. They are our life support system. But rainforests are at grave risk. Every second of every day, an irreplaceable rainforest the size of a football field is destroyed. Powerful economic and political interests are driving their destruction to produce beef, palm oil, and paper, wiping out countless species from existence, marginalizing the poor and deepening inequality, threatening the survival of indigenous communities, and destroying the best solution for climate change that we have. But there is still hope, where a different future awaits us, where faith unites us to make rainforests a shared spiritual priority, where we teach our communities that rainforests are a sacred trust, where we feed a growing planet without converting rainforests, where we work with companies to ensure their products are deforestation-free, and where we make sure that governments protect forests and the rights of indigenous peoples. This is the future where we do what is right. But we need to come together, affirm that protecting rainforests is a moral responsibility for all people of faith, mobilize a movement built on the values we share across our religions and spiritual traditions, stewardship of the earth and care for creation, a respect for human rights and human dignity, social and economic justice. The Interfaith Rainforest Initiative is doing just that. From the Amazon to the Congo Basin to the forests of Southeast Asia, rallying faith communities to act. We must end deforestation because her life depends on it. His life depends on it. Their future depends on it. We all depend on it.
For a rainforest to exist, there must be a warm climate, which explains why a vast majority of tropical rainforest regions are situated on or near the equator. Brazil claims the largest rainforest reserve on the entire globe, which is situated in the Amazon River basin. Rainforests cover about 6% of the total surface of the earth and are home to more than half of the species of plants and animals of the world. At least 2/3 of the total plant species grows in the rainforests, and the hot and humid climate of rainforests is very supportive to the growth of plants and animals. It is believed that there are many millions of species of plants, insects, and microorganisms thriving in rainforests, which still have not been discovered. The main benefit of rainforests is that they supply much of the Earth's oxygen. They also absorb carbon dioxide produced by man-made activities. And rainforests also help, among many things, to stabilize the world's climate, maintain water cycles, provide home to the indigenous peoples, and protect the environments against soil erosion, floods, and droughts. These forests took well over 90 million years to evolve, and they are also considered the oldest and most sophisticated land-based ecosystems on planet Earth and harbor more than 30 million bird and animal species alone. Indigenous people have been living in these rainforests in harmony with its ecosystem, and they rely on the rainforests for food, medicine, and shelter. The indigenous peoples began to be threatened by logging, oil, and other extraction industries. Workers from these extraction industries introduced diseases to the indigenous people who lacked resistance to them that threatened their very survival. These commercial activities force these indigenous people to also relocate out of their natural habitat. If we could show slide 1, please. This slide shows where the rainforests are located in the world. The Interfaith Rainforest Initiative currently does work in 5 countries: Brazil, Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Indonesia, and Peru, which together contain 70% of the world's remaining tropical forests. When logging companies cut down and remove the trees, the soil no longer has the grip of the roots and the protection of the canopy that the trees provide. When heavy rains fall, the unprotected soil is washed away, resulting in floods and blockages in downstream areas. This phenomenon could also render upland rivers dry. Rainforests are huge water storehouses. The Amazon forests alone store more than half of the entire planet's rainwater. It's a cycle in which rainforest trees absorb water from the floor of the forest and emitted back to the atmosphere in the form of cloud and mists. If rainforests were not available, then droughts would be prevalent because there would be no water stored to feed the rivers that lead to lakes and oceans. Trees also help to rid the atmosphere of dangerous gases, and combustion of rainforests triggers the release of carbon dioxide, which greatly contributes to climate change and global warming. Now, 84% of the world's population are adherents to some religious or faith tradition. And the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative has fully understood this tremendous resource and mobilization potential of faith communities to be not only the moral voice, but the voice of advocacy, inspiration, and action to help prevent the destruction of our rainforests. IRI has created two beautiful documents that are clear and set forth how communities of faith can get involved in saving and protecting our rainforests. So let's pull up slide number 2, please. And I start with this beautiful resource guide. And I will say that IRI has produced some of the most aesthetically beautiful and substantively rich products for all of us to be able to access on their website and to read. And this resource guide on rainforest protection for religious communities is especially important. And this resource guide provides the spiritual imperative to protect rainforests from 10 religious traditions. And the 10 religious traditions are indicated on this slide. And I will take the time to read. This is not the totality of the explanations or the writings given on each of these spiritual and religious perspectives. So these are just inspiring extractions from the quite extensive written materials on each of these 10 religious traditions. So the Baha'i perspective, the elements and lower organisms are synchronized in the great plan of life. Shall man, infinitely above them in degree, be antagonistic and a destroyer of that perfection? The Buddhist perspective, the crisis we are facing now is fundamentally spiritual in nature. We mistakenly believe that material acquisition will bring fulfillment. The Christian perspective, we are also commanded to care for the earth and all its creatures, because the earth belongs to God, not to us. We do this for the sake of the Lord Jesus Christ, who is the creator, owner, sustainer, redeemer, and heir of all creation. A Confucius perspective, heaven is my father, and earth is my mother, and even such small creatures as I find an intimate place in their midst. Therefore, that which fills the universe I regard as my body, and that which directs the universe I consider as my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters. The Taoist perspective, trees are also intimately connected to our very existence. The trees have their own intrinsic value to exist, which is beyond our power. Can the rainforest also teach us the way out of this entanglement of global problems to a more beautiful, sustainable, and compassionate world? Slide 4, a Hindu perspective. Hindu traditions regard all of nature, indeed all of creation, as sacred. The one divine being is a source of everything that exists and is present equally in everything. An Islamic perspective, we need forests because we need air, water, and food. Thus, cutting the trees of forests, we're cutting our own umbilical cord, while in the very stomach of Mother Earth. Islam teaches us that the massive cutting of trees and plants is sinful. The Jewish perspective, an ancient Jewish homily, tells us that when the Holy One, blessed be He, created the first human being, He took that person around all the trees in the Garden of Eden and said, "See my works, how fine and excellent they are, which I have created for you. Think upon this and do not corrupt or destroy my world, for if you corrupt it, there is no one to set it right for you." A Shinto perspective. Shinto shrines represent Japanese inherent religious culture. And their sacred forests symbolize the abundant natural blessings of the mountains, rivers, and the sea. All things, both living and non-living, have spiritual lives. A Sikh perspective. Rather, we should accord the very same respect that is given to a place of worship, to preserve the earth's rainforests, and to honor and acknowledge their irreplaceable role is not an optional duty. The resource guide gives practical ways in which religious communities can get involved. And we have the personal choices. Now, in each of these indications here of getting, the communities to be involved, there are very specific explanations given. And here I would just give very brief synopsis. For the personal choices, when we understand that it is within our control to honor the planet and forests by making conscious and informed decisions that signal awareness of what we are consuming and from where it is sourced, and who is producing what we use, we can make better choices. So let's consider that beef, soy, palm oil, and pulp and paper are together responsible for a large share of deforestation globally. And over the last 30 years, the Amazon rainforest has become one of the main cattle ranching regions in the world. And with 5 to 8% annual expansion, the growth of cattle herd is still strongly affecting forest resources in this region. And around 15% of the Amazon forest has been removed through agricultural practices. Pastures cover 80% of deforested areas and represent the main land use. Cattle herd growth is a good indicator of expansion of the agricultural frontier. There is a suggestion in the resource guide to consider shifting to a more plant-based diet. And it also asks us to consider not being wasteful of food that represents the squandering of land and resources that produce the food, including the water it took to grow the food. And wastage also includes not overbuying, as we have gotten so used to throwing away good food that we do not consume. Religious community action. The resource guide is very, it gives really wonderful explanations, and it provides practical suggestions here. And religious institutions and places of worship, for example, can incorporate forests into existing communal religious activities and practices, such as liturgies, large prayer gatherings, or celebrations around festivals, feasts, or commemorations. On the economic action, in 2018, 44 major investment houses whose collective assets under management total $6.4 trillion alerted food companies that to qualify for investment capital, they would need to show evidence of due diligence to ensure that the company's supply chains are not contributing to deforestation. And in 2019, Norway's government pension fund, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, divested from a range of companies involved in the development of palm oil plantations, adding to the market signals that such activities are unacceptable. In education, some of the most powerful lessons can be taken from forests are not the intellectual learning regarding forest loss rates and numbers of displaced native peoples, important as these are, but it really is a heart learning that teaches appreciation of forests in their spiritual fullness. Attitudes towards forests and trees could be markedly changed for Western audiences if forests were viewed primarily as a gift rather than resources. And Indigenous traditions have much to teach in this regard. Gratitude and sufficiency are familiar concepts to people of many faiths. It is not a stretch to imagine applying these attitudes widely in our use of paper, wood, and other forest products. Such a shift could be transformational, and the casual consumption that characterizes market economies could shift to one of awe and care and gratitude with salutary impacts on forests worldwide. And political action, mobilizing political will to confront the drivers of deforestation, requires political advocacy by religious leaders, institutions, and places of worship. Many religious leaders are uniquely positioned to lobby governments at local, regional, national, and global levels, and other decision-making bodies that determine the policies and practices that govern forests and the rights of their guardians. Now, advocacy can take various forms, ranging from quiet diplomacy and back-channel meetings to more public statements, campaigns, petitions, and demonstrations around the moral and spiritual responsibility to protect forests. The multi-religious collaboration. The gains from deploying religious resources in the fight against deforestation are multiplied when the world's religions stand together. And this kind of cooperation can prove more powerful symbolically and substantively than unilateral action by individual religious groups. And each religious tradition has wisdom, experience, and resources to bring to the table. And through multi-religious partnership, these distinctive gifts can complement each other so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. When religious communities demonstrate the ability to work closely together, they build credibility and trust among the population at large. When they speak with one voice on issues like climate change and rainforest protection, their moral authority is magnified. And they have a greater ability to influence policies through their influence on individuals and institutions. Now there are 6 UN Global Forest Goals that are very important for us to be able to identify. So Goal 1 reverses the loss of forest cover worldwide through sustainable forest management. Goal 2 enhances forest-based economic, social, and environmental benefits, including by improving the livelihoods of forest indigenous and dependent people. Goal 3 is to increase significantly the area of protected forests worldwide and other areas of sustainably managed forests. Goal 4 is to mobilize significantly increased, new, and additional financial resources from all sources for the implementation of sustainable forest management and strengthen scientific and technical cooperation and partnerships. Goal 5 is to promote governance frameworks to implement sustainable forest management. And Goal 6 is to enhance cooperation, coordination, coherence, and synergies on forest-related issues at all levels. Slide 7, please. The second important document that I want to cover is the Forests and Pandemics, how tropical forests can prevent coronaviruses and other emerging diseases, an issue primer for religious leaders and faith communities. What is the connection between the destruction of our rainforests and coronaviruses and emerging diseases? The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare a broken relationship with nature, our global economy, consumption patterns, and production systems not only endanger nature, but our own well-being. And the pandemic is a warning sign. Failing to care for the planet, for forests, and for biodiversity means not taking care of ourselves. Slide 8, please. The key facts are tropical deforestation and the destruction of wildlife habitat create the conditions for the emergence of new diseases to which humans have little resistance and which can become the basis for pandemics. The human encroachment into tropical forests driven by land conversion for agriculture and demand for commodities like beef, soy, and palm oil is leading to animal-human interactions that did not exist previously, enabling pathogens once found only in animals to jump to human hosts. And COVID-19, like Ebola, SARS, avian flu, and other recent epidemics, is an infectious disease that originated from animals. The COVID-19 pandemic and the potential for future pandemics are closely tied to tropical deforestation. Next slide, please. Zoonotic diseases are infectious diseases that jump from animals to humans. and they pose a serious threat to human health, representing more than 60% of all infectious diseases in humans. And here is, you can see a list of infectious diseases that have accelerated in recent years because of animal to human pathogenic transfers. And now the question arises, what is the connection between deforestation and zoonotic diseases? And tropical forest loss is connected to zoonotic diseases in several ways, including loss of ecosystem services, forest and habitat fragmentation, biodiversity loss, wildlife trade, and forest fires. As forest fragmentation increases and forest edges grow, the likelihood of disease transmission through human-wildlife contact grows. Next slide, please. We must know of the vulnerability of Indigenous people and forest communities. The challenges that Indigenous peoples face as guardians of the planet's rainforests are aggravated by the threat of disease outbreaks as illegal loggers, miners, and others encroach upon their lands and territories. Now, infectious diseases like coronaviruses pose a grave health threat to these Indigenous people around the world, and they are particularly vulnerable to external diseases and tend to have poor access to healthcare and essential services. And the challenges facing Indigenous people during the COVID-19 pandemic are at once a human rights and public health issue, as well as an environmental crisis. And any threat to the health, safety, and well-being of Indigenous peoples is therefore a threat to rainforest health and to the health of the planet. Now, the next slide shows how religious leaders and faith communities can get involved. And the first is to raise awareness. And most people are not yet familiar with the important connections between tropical deforestation and disease outbreaks, nor are they aware of the protective health effects of keeping nature and rainforests intact. Religious leaders are in a unique position to share this information with their communities and to raise awareness on this issue. And most people do not understand or even know about this animal to human pathogenic transfers. And since we have all experienced COVID, not only within our own lives, within the lives of our family, our workspaces, but also the entire global economy, we should all learn more about these pathogenic transfers. The next is a demand that policymakers commit to building back better with their economic recovery plans. And how political leaders decide to stimulate the economy in response to the COVID crisis will determine whether we amplify or mitigate the environmental conditions behind the pandemic. And if these recovery packages relax environmental laws and promote the resumption of current practices unchanged, forest conditions will continue to deteriorate. And religious leaders and their communities can call on policymakers to summon the courage to make their economic packages truly transformative recovery plans that invest in people and nature rather than repeat unsustainable patterns. The stress on the forest and human health connection. The link between forest destruction and fragmentation and the spread of disease is well established. The way we currently use forests and exploit forest wildlife increases the risk of passing animal diseases to humans and measurably increases the risk of future pandemics. And fighting deforestation is an important way to fight pandemics and keep our communities safe. This can be a central message when addressing the coronavirus-related health concerns of congregations. And much as with climate change, we have the moral responsibility not to leave our children a world that is biologically impoverished and unable to provide the disease regulation services that healthy forest ecosystems provide. And then we advocate for forest protection as a disease prevention priority. Finding alternatives to deforestation is not only critical to addressing climate change and meeting sustainable development goals on water, poverty, food security, biodiversity, and so forth, but is also a matter of good health. Our thinking about disease prevention must change so that we integrate the protection, restoration, and sustainable management of forests as preventive measures for future pandemics. This includes ensuring that the collection and trade of forest wildlife, a potent source of direct contact with disease organisms, is safe, legal, and humane. And finally, to participate in forest restoration activities, community-based tree planting and other forest restoration projects that help restore the health of local forest ecosystems and forest biodiversity are a concrete way to improve the disease regulation service that healthy forests provide. And such projects make the spiritual act of stewardship tangible and personal, and they also reinforce the value of community action in meeting global forest restoration goals one landscape at a time, with each community empowered to contribute. And then on our last slide, let us unite all people of faith and even people without faith to end tropical deforestation. IRI brings the commitment, influence, and moral authority of religions to efforts to protect the world's rainforests and the indigenous peoples that serve as their guardians. And Ron initially had given away my surprise that I wanted to share with all of you by announcing the presence of Dr. Charles Mcneill. And it is so wonderful that he has been able to join us and attend this event because, you know, he heads the United Nations Environment Program's Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. And he is without a doubt one of the foremost experts on the world's rainforests, and is really quite a benefit to all of us that we can hear from him directly. And he oversees not only RRI and forest and climate policy, but previously he served in UNDP for 25 years with responsibility for environmental policy and programs and empowering Indigenous peoples and civil society. And in 2014, he led the establishment of the New York Declaration on Forests. In 2008, he co-founded the United Nations Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation Program. And I do wish to extend my deepest appreciation to Dr. Mcneill and his fabulous IRI team for the aesthetically beautiful and substantively rich materials that they have been able to generate for communities of faith and people everywhere. And please do see these materials, read them, download them, print them up, and distribute them on the UNEP's IRI website or the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation website. To access these materials, they're all freely available to each and every one of you. And Dr. Mcneill, it is really my pleasure and my honor to be able to have you participate with us and to share with us about your important work. Thank you so much, and you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Audrey Kitagawa. What an honor it is to participate in this event with the Institute on Religions in an Age of Science. Thank you, Dr. Maynard Moore, and thank you, Dr. Ron Cole Turner, for your introduction. And it's a privilege to speak here and to follow Audrey Kitagawa's very thorough presentation. I must say that Audrey Kitagawa has covered this topic so well. I'll look to see if there are a couple of points I can compliment on what she said. And I want to say that I'm so pleased to speak to this group of religious leaders and academicians and scientists and so on. This is exactly the group that we're trying to bring together as the UN, as Audrey Kitagawa spoke about, in this Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. For me, after now nearly 30 years with the UN, it's such an exciting opportunity to see the energy and power of the religious world, religious leaders, faith communities, bringing their formidable commitment and assets and resources to bear on this climate, forest, Indigenous peoples challenge. So I never expected after all this time to be spending all my time now working with religious leaders and Indigenous leaders throughout the tropics on trying to protect these forests, but it's been a great education. I think might be useful to just go into detail on 4 points. One would be say a little bit more about that link between tropical forest loss and climate change, the existential threat of our time. And second, a little bit more about what's the status of forest loss now and what's causing this loss. And a third point could be to ask the question, can we really afford to protect tropical forests given the need to produce food for all the people in the world? And then the last point, a little bit more about Indigenous peoples and how we as Interfaith Rainforest Initiative are working with them. So back to that point about more elaborating on that, Audrey Kitagawa said so much about why tropical forests are important. So in addition to driving the extinction of countless plant and animal species, undermining the lives and livelihoods of Indigenous peoples, and contributing to the global public health crisis, as Audrey Kitagawa said, tropical deforestation also happens to be a disaster for climate change. It's simply making the world a hotter, drier, and more dangerous place. And this is particularly regrettable because if we were to protect those forests, in fact, they offer 1/3 of the solution to avoiding catastrophic climate change. If we were to protect and restore the world's forests, that actually gets us 1/3 of the way to meeting the Paris climate goals. Just those interventions themselves. So the fact that tropical deforestation is contributing to climate change when it could be solving the problem, that needs to be addressed. And also the rainfall issue. Forests are known to generate rainfall across entire continents, ensuring the productivity of the world's agricultural systems, both locally and half a world away. That's really not generally known. Now, if tropical deforestation were a country, its annual contribution to climate change would be the 3rd highest in the world after the US and China. So it's truly a significant contributor. And we just can't, all of us working on this know that we can't meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement without decisive action in this area. So clearly we're facing a crisis of existential proportions. We either deal with it or we leave future generations with a planet in ecological collapse, and we can't have that. A little bit more about this, the status of the forests today. In spite of some progress that's been made, and we can say more about that a little later, still it's not enough. And data some months ago showed that as Audrey Kitagawa mentioned, and as Jane Goodall also mentioned, that we're losing a football field worth of tropical rainforest every 6 seconds, every minute, every hour, every day, every week, every month, throughout the year, every 6 seconds. And Brazil is single-handedly making up 1/3 of that. Audrey Kitagawa talked about the importance of Brazil. They're making up 1/3 of all the loss, and that's especially troubling because they actually were a best practice some years ago. They actually solved that one in terms of reducing deforestation. But right now, the current administration is proposing administration to allow commercial mining and oil extraction in Indigenous peoples' territories. They've relaxed law enforcement efforts in the midst of this political, financial, and now COVID crisis. More hopefully, Indonesia, interestingly enough, has decreased their forest loss by 5% compared to the year before. This is making it the 3rd year in a row of reduced levels of deforestation. So Indonesia is actually doing something right. And Colombia also has experienced a significant decrease in primary forest loss after heavy losses that they faced following the 2016 peace agreement, which ended the conflict, but also led to massive deforestation. So the latest data shows that the fight to curb deforestation is far from over. More action and leadership is urgently needed. And so what's causing this loss? We heard that's true. Commercial scale clearing of forests, much of it illegal. So illegal activities for commercial activities, with agriculture being the primary driver of deforestation. especially as Audrey said, to produce beef, soy, palm oil, and timber. And since cattle ranching drives 80% of the deforestation of the Amazon, that does suggest that it would be useful for us to reduce our beef consumption as one concrete step to take. But can we afford to protect forests given the need to feed the planet? And that's what's really interesting. I've seen this issue evolve over the past 30 years, and I'm really gratified to see where we are now, in the sense that it's time to clear up that misconception. We do not need to choose between forests or food. It's a false choice. Already, we've developed half of all the vegetated land on the planet, and most of it for agriculture. It's hard to imagine that half of all the vegetated area on the planet has been developed by humans. So half of the habitable land, it happens to be used for agriculture, and 77% for livestock. But the truth is that half for that is enough. It's not a matter of claiming more land, but making better use of what we already have. We can produce the food the world needs, even to feed the expected 10 billion people by 2050, while staying within our planetary boundaries. So to do so, we need a couple of things. We need to transform the world's food system over the next decade, and that means encouraging a major shift in global diets to more plant-based food, reducing food waste, as Audrey has said, and we need to increase the productivity and efficiency of our food production. So the facts are that there is enough land for both production and protection, and we don't need to destroy one more hectare of tropical rainforest for that purpose. And one more point, last point has to do with Indigenous peoples. We've seen over these recent decades that one proven way to protect forests that should be rapidly scaled up is granting Indigenous peoples legal title to their traditional lands. That's simple. Granting Indigenous peoples legal title to their traditional lands. Studies show that when Indigenous peoples' land rights are legally recognized and protected by governments, deforestation rates and carbon dioxide rates are significantly lower, not to mention the benefits for biodiversity. In many parts of the world, Indigenous peoples face serious threats as they defend their forests from incursion by extractive industries like mining, logging, oil, poaching, and agribusiness. And this has increased significantly over the past year due to COVID-19, where governments have withdrawn any protection for Indigenous communities that may have existed beforehand. So given their cultural and spiritual connections to the forest, their vast stores of traditional knowledge, and the fact that much of the world's remaining forests lie within their ancestral lands, Indigenous peoples are essential partners in any efforts to protect rainforests. And that's why one of the greatest pleasures and delights for me in working on the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative is that we're seeing an historic new kind of bond and partnership evolve in all those 5 countries that Audrey mentioned. Indigenous peoples and religious leaders are healing their centuries-old breakdowns and ill feeling, that there's a kind of healing happening, because it's so clear that we're not going to solve this problem without the leadership of religious leaders and faith communities and the Indigenous peoples. And seeing those groups work together in a new way is incredibly exciting. Just my last point will be with regard to some work that we in the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative have been doing in support of Indigenous peoples. In Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, right now, landmark legislation is being considered by the National Assembly that for the first time specifically recognizes Indigenous peoples' rights. And through the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, this is also the first time that religious leaders in that country, Democratic Republic of Congo, have come together across faiths to support Indigenous peoples and this legislation with a powerful declaration that explicitly recognizes Indigenous peoples as holders of rights, holders of valuable traditional knowledge, and holders of a unique and valid spirituality. When religious leaders speak out in the DRC and in other countries, governments listen, governments respond. And so we're hopeful that this historic legislation can be approved over the next few months. In Asia, we're working in Indonesia the largest predominantly Muslim country in the world. And the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative is undertaking an encouraging process there also to heal the historic wound between religious and indigenous leaders. During the launch of our initiative early last year, leaders of all 6 formal religious groups in Indonesia, representing the Muslims, the Catholics, the Protestants, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Confucians, all stood together with the leaders of the major indigenous peoples groups, and they declared in unison their solidarity on indigenous rights to land and culture. And now they're working together to implement this joint commitment. In Latin America, where the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative programs are offering direct support and rapid deployment of food and health supplies and services to indigenous communities in the Amazon to address the COVID crisis. So we're working hard on that issue, and it's an incredibly central issue. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to any questions and comments. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you, indeed. Thank you. We've been listening to Dr. Charles Mcneill, and those of you who may have joined us midstream, I'm sure you were aware immediately of his competence in the scientific as well as the political arena. He's worked for 25 years or so for the United Nations environmental program, particularly now with the Interfaith Forest Initiative. Before that, we were listening to Audrey Kitagawa, who, as introduced earlier, spent many years in law practice in Honolulu, but has devoted the last few decades, the most recent few decades of her life, to this work of organizing at various levels through the United Nations, through the Parliament of the World Religions. So thank you so much to both of you. Now, in a moment, I'm going to introduce a respondent. Before I do that, let me remind our listeners that we have a question and answer process. I have right now only 2 questions in the queue, so there's plenty of room for your questions. What you do to pose a question is go down to the bottom of the screen, open the Q&A link, and you will see the little box. Type your question in. I'll review it here, and then I will queue up these questions for our various speakers. So technical questions, scientific questions, policy questions, political questions, but above all, how to mediate the mix of the world's faith traditions with the world's political leaders to find a pathway forward for humanity as a whole to address this enormous challenge in front of us. To help us toward that end, we go to Tariq Mustafa, coming to us from his expertise, first as a mechanical engineer, and outstanding work in Pakistan in the space and rocket technology program. Then in finishing that work on into senior leadership positions in the government in Pakistan, federal secretary in ministries of defense and other vital areas of government ministry there in Pakistan. And you might be interested to know that he was one of the the founder and the current chair of the Pakistan National Paralympics Committee, something a little bit outside of our topic tonight, but it gives you a sense of the scope and the character of our next speaker. Not just Pakistan, but co-chair, if I'm reading this right, vice president of the Asia Paralympics Committee. In the most recent decades, a more formal turn to a lifelong interest in a faith tradition and in balancing, as he puts it, reason, the scientific, the engineering frame of mind, with revelation, the spiritual and faith-based frame of mind. Can those work together to illumine our humanity from all of its diversity to address the challenges. So, Tariq Mustafa, let's go to you, and you're going to take a few minutes to describe, to offer your response, and then offer some questions and comments. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ron. Let me get a... Yeah, okay. We've had an excellent discourse from both the speakers. So now we know all about the rainforests and their significance and importance to life. Here's a quick look, and it's spread over the continents. And we've heard that the one in South America, Brazil, that is the Amazon forest, is the most important, but that does not mean that the others are any less significant. So what I thought, since everything has been covered about rainforests, that I will perhaps, in the scheme of things, broaden the focus and see what other existential challenges, along with the cutting of the rainforest, is upon us. So here we take a quick look at them, and that first one comes to mind is the accelerating environmental damage, of which this talk very much is a part. Natural resources degradation. We already know the pressures that the world supply of good water, clean water, and soon we suspect air will be facing. The possibility of bottled air is not far away. And then the WMDs, the weapons of mass destruction, now are being added to via cyber warfare. And that only broadens the spectrum, which leads to rise in extremism and forced migration of peoples. And what we see every day is that the income inequalities are increasing, both amongst the nation as well as within the nations. And finally, and not the least one, is the population explosion, starting from 1 billion, I'm told, around the year 1800. We've already come close to 8 billion, and there is talk that it may well go to 10 to 11 before things stabilize. So the problem that we heard, we cannot touch all of these things, but we have to bear in mind that they are on the horizon, you see. Now, we've heard about the importance and significance of water, which is indeed the case. But what is the reason? Why is water so important? It is, scholars tell us that it was both important for the evolution of life, humanity, and that is as well as its sustenance. And the reason, one of the reasons is that it is a very good solvent amongst the chemicals. And it has a molecular composition, 1 oxygen and 2 hydrogen atoms, which makes it interacts both with itself as well as with many other chemicals. And then water supports structure. What I understood from this is that the shape and form of the cells are sustained because of the properties of water. And we are told that without water, DNA could not retain its helical structure and perform the function that we all know. And finally, that water supports multiple chemical reactions. These are some of the things which have made it so important and so significant. Now, human rights demand that free access to fresh water and clean air is provided by the society. And this is the viewpoint emanating from both science and religion or revelation, an area to which IRAS is devoted to study its intellectual resources. These two are the only valid sources of knowledge, and they both affirm that water and air are essential, and thus all humans have a right to both these things. And interestingly, something which is not often noticed is that both hydrogen and the hydroxyl, which are two components of the water, in their elemental forms are poisonous by themselves, and yet their combination becomes water, which is so life-giving. So nature has given us something which we need to value. And even more, hydrogen and the hydroxyl ion, they interestingly are not only important for life on this earth, but it has been found through the SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Observations, that they are the best microwave channel for communication across the universe, because they're transparent. Otherwise, we will not be able to see the far reaches of the universe. Moving on, we heard about the mention of religious support to this concept. And I'll just take two examples. That Bible mentions water almost 20 times. And in all the springs of water which were created for mankind, and there was water under the vault and water above it. So water, without water there could not be life. And then we come to Quran, which also mentions water in 63 verses, amazingly. And the statement that we have created every living thing from water, will they not then believe? Quran is saying this. It's throwing a challenge, giving us the significance of water. And in the next verse, it again says that there are different types of life, some that walk on two legs, referring to humans. Now, there are other qualities of rainwater mentioned in the Quran, amazingly, that it is the sustainer, it is the giver of life, it is bringer of vegetation, and surprisingly, it is an accounter. It is also a destructive force. We all know about the tsunamis. Ask the Indonesians what they keep on suffering, you see. But we are told that heaven will be filled with gardens and springs, and water is used for purification ritually, both in Islam as well as the Christian baptism. Now, we are coming to our end, and having this large coverage and knowing the expertise of our speakers, my question is that the above list of exponential existential problems has been debated ad nauseum for the last 50 years with minor differences. This position is arguably accepted by a majority of the world's population, at least by thinking people, and yet there has been severe absence of much remedial action. With such great experience of working with UN agencies of our speakers, what one would like to know are the major causes of such woeful inaction. Can much be done without drastic change in the role, status, and attitudes of principal members of the UN? Thank you very much. I hand it back to Ron.
Well, thank you. Our speakers will join us here on the screen. I think, Tariq, you will need to end the share screen option. There we go. All right. And so I'm sure Audrey will join us. So there should be 4 of us on the screen right now. Well, you've heard the challenge. I expect you know all too well what the answer is, but you don't know the answer to the answer, how to make the opposition turn into support. But what are the main causes, the main drivers of opposition? Either Dr. Mcneil or Audrey Kitagawa, either one.
I'm happy to give it a try. What a great question, Tariq Mustafa. You put your finger on the challenge of the ages. And yes, these challenges have been well known for a long time, and yet these problems persist. And that's a very impressive list of additional problems that you laid out. Maybe I'll focus a little bit on, in answer to your question, from the perspective of tropical rainforests and climate change. So what's the cause of inaction? The truth is we have a financial system, an economic system that doesn't value things that are important. For example, in the case of forests, you can, a community or a logging company can get a little bit of money for a dead tree, a log, and yet the value of that tree alive is so much greater than the value of that tree dead. And yet we have a kind of a warped financial system that doesn't recognize the value of preventing the floods and droughts that Audrey talked about, that protecting the soil, the benefits of the rainfall locally and a continent away. All these incredible services that trees in their environment provide, called ecosystem services. These ecosystem services are generally not properly valued. Now, there's all kinds of initiatives that are coming on stream that are beginning to turn the tide on that. But that is one of the short-term causes of this problem. And fortunately, over these past decades, we now know what it takes to stop deforestation and what it takes to solve those other problems that Dr. Mustafa laid out. It comes down to public policies. It comes down to laws and regulations. It comes down to enforcement and finance, and it requires strong government action supported by civil society and business. And that's why with the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, we're so encouraged by that, because the political power that the 84% of humankind who are affiliated with a religion can bring to bear on government is formidable. And the way this translates, to give an example of Brazil, I mentioned that Brazil is deforestation rates are exploding now, but this wasn't always the case. Between 2004 and 2012, Brazil actually reduced their deforestation rate by 80%. And they did it by four things: increasing law enforcement, expanding protected areas, recognizing indigenous territories, and applying incentives, financial incentives, to slow the conversion to agriculture. And the dramatic reduction of deforestation happened at the same time that agricultural productivity increased, proving that we can protect forests while increasing food production. So I can tell the same story with Indonesia and so on, but finance is key. There needs to be, for forests, you need to pay for reduced emissions from protected forests, needs to be part. International community needs to get involved and pay. And then domestic agricultural subsidies that undermine forests need to be modified to grow economies without forest loss. Globally, there are all these perverse agricultural incentives that lead to more fertilizers, more pesticides, water loss, energy loss. So it comes down to public policy ultimately. And transparency is also important. Remote sensing tools are helping communities and law enforcement see in almost real time the encroachments, the illegal encroachments that's happening. So there are solutions out there, and they're starting to be applied. And to your question, you asked, can much of this be done without drastic change in the role, status, and attitudes of principal members of the UN? Yes, these individual members need to act like Brazil needs to act like they did, but the community needs to come together like they did for the Paris climate meeting, like they will do for the climate meeting in Glasgow in November. There are opportunities where the world community comes together, changes the rules, agrees on things, and makes them happy, makes them happen. The record has been mixed, but I'm seeing an encouraging trend of countries coming together in a powerful way. And the U.S. joining back in the Paris Climate Agreement is incredibly hopeful and important. So I see some real potential along the lines of what you're pointing to, Dr. Mustafa, at least in the climate and deforestation area. Those other areas would require a careful look individually.
Well, my attempt was actually to try to point out that there is a root problem here, and that is that our stress, this is not a national problem, these are international problems. And they have to be tackled internationally. And unfortunately, we are going more towards nations. Make my nation great again. We should rather be thinking in terms of making the world community strong,
Yes.
balanced, equitable.
Agree 100%.
Exactly. So and of course, the rest of it is going to be a big grind, which all sensitive people of the world have tried to do. But so let's keep it up. That is what I think organizations like yours and IRAS and so on are attempting to do.
And Dr. Tariq, also to your point, we cannot escape the power that political leaders wield. And, we are still dealing, no matter what the position in society and national life is, we still have to come down to a basic fundamental point. And that is, what are the qualities within the leader with respect to their ethical, moral fiber and foundation and grounding? And to the extent that we can find leaders who have not the proper indices of leadership, that is very, very important. And unfortunately, if we value, leaders who are billionaires, who are reality TV stars, and I don't want to, shout out names here, but I think we have seen the sweep of authoritarianism and throughout the world, and the policies that such powerful leaders can bring to bear within their own respective countries can set the countries back by many, many years. So in all situations, the ethical, moral quality and principles of the leaders are very important. And this is also true for all people everywhere, whether you are known or unknown, you are a leader in some realm, whether in your own life, within your family, within your community, and so forth. So always it will boil down to the individual's responsibility to always cultivate the inner spiritual life and to uphold those values and principles that the great teachers and masters and mystics and the sacred texts arise from, and that is always to have a moral compass.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. I think at this point, it would be really good if we could open this up to questions from our wider audience, and they're beginning to come in. There's room for plenty more. I will read them off my phone here and propose them to our speakers. But if you would like to pose a question, again, go down to the bottom of the screen, open the Q&A link, and type your question in. Another one just came in. Thank you. So let's continue with this theme of leaders. Brazil had a change of leadership at a key point, and I assume that was behind some of the shifts in policy. One of the questions has to do with the vulnerabilities faced by environmental activists, some of whom have paid with their lives. And I assume there's a connection between the stance of an administration and the protection afforded to Indigenous peoples, their leaders and environmental activists who come alongside. Any thoughts about that? In one respect, it's a local issue, it's a national issue. Can we in other parts of the world weigh in any way, any meaningful way, to the protection of those who are on the ground actually waging the struggle?
I would love to jump in on that question. It's a concern that occurs to us every day, and that usually environmental activists, environmental protectors, are usually a majority often Indigenous peoples. And it's a tragic phenomenon that's happening around the world. Global Witness is a group that actually monitors and tracks the numbers of environmental defenders who are killed in protecting their lands every year. And I don't have the figures for 2020 yet, but there are several hundreds and hundreds a year. And they are focused in certain countries, but they do go across the board. And UNEP, UN Environment Program that I work with, has a program called the Environmental Defenders Initiative. And associated with that is a hotline for groups to be able to register threats and concerns. There's a number of dimensions to that program, but it's directed exactly at this issue. For the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, in each of the 5 countries that Audrey Kitagawa mentioned, the teams working there are looking at least in building, in some cases, a sanctuary program where religious leaders can offer some kind of sanctuary to Indigenous peoples under persecution and threat. Another thing that we need to keep in mind is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, agreed by the world's countries some 20 years ago or so. That imbues and holds a commitment to protect Indigenous people's rights. And so countries need to be pressured by their own citizens to implement and fulfill that declaration. Also, what we're seeing to help with this is that certain programs, like one that I was involved in starting, the UN RED program, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, embedded Indigenous leaders as full board members. So Indigenous peoples themselves are part of the decision making, and they can control where the resources is, and they can help ensure that the right kind of protection is put in there. And then it's also important to give voice to Indigenous peoples, to include them in any kind of global and national conferences, and we do that often. And that's a way to give voice and power to these people. But I really appreciate the question. It needs to be on all of our minds all the time, and we're certainly working on that very hard.
Yeah, Audrey, feel free to jump in at any point. But
yes, thank you so much. These are really, it goes again to political will and political processes as to how well we can protect Indigenous people and protect all vulnerable people, because there are multiple issues that we can see within our own countries that, can really jeopardize the lives of marginalized and vulnerable peoples. So this again goes to the political processes and political will of the body politic to be able to make commitments to protect the rights of the vulnerable and the marginalized. And it goes to the deeper issues of our historic, colonization processes and history and power dynamics that play across the board on these issues, and that we have not really, really gotten a handle on and gone to levels of causation that really call into on the table these power dynamics and who is the holder of the power and who seeks to maintain their power and at whose expense. These are significant, historic, but also current issues that we really need to deeply analyze and address.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. And it seems to me that that's one place where religion, the religions of the world, the faith traditions, the spiritual traditions have a role to play in.
And may I just, sorry to interrupt here, Ron, but also may I suggest that it will also be very important for these religious institutions and infrastructures to also turn the searchlight inward on this very issue as well, because they also have been holders of significant power historically. Right. And so, yes, they have an important role to play in this ceaseless, fearless self-examination and to turn that searchlight inward to examine their own institutions.
Yes, I'm painfully aware of the offenses of my own tradition. Looking, for instance, at indigenous people as maybe not human, or if they are, then they need to be converted, right? I mean, so just no end to the problems that lie in the history of our religious traditions or the neglect of the moment. At the same time, is it possible for the religious traditions, our enlightened leaders of all traditions, to help the general public pay attention and to attach importance to this set of concerns so that when it comes time for a national election in a major country, US or Brazil comes to mind, the population has a kind of moral, a spiritually grounded moral framework with which to ask intelligent questions of the candidates and make possibly selections that lead us perhaps to a better outcome. I see, Charles, you're nodding. Please go ahead.
Yes, you really put your finger on an important point, and what we're seeing now in these 5 countries that contain 70% of the world's rainforest, that local chapters are being established exactly along those lines where the local religious leaders with the local indigenous leaders and the NGOs, the scientists are all getting together in those regions with the highest rates of deforestation. And they're starting to really influence the local politics. And in Colombia, an amazing experience happened there in 36 local regions where they basically convened the candidates for mayor to come together and have a debate. And in those debates, each mayor or candidate committed that if they are elected, they will prioritize protecting the forest and prioritize protecting indigenous people's rights. And then once the elections happened, these local IRI groups went back to them and says, remember what you promised. And then these Interfaith Rainforest Initiative people are invited to be on the land management group overseeing the development plan of the whole region. So that's exactly what's happening in each of these countries, is targeting the local political leaders so that their discourse and their action and their commitments line up. And it's very exciting to see exactly what you were referring to.
Yes, I think this aspect of accountability that Dr. Mcneil is raising is exceedingly important. And more, I think people in political leadership or any leadership have to understand that this aspect of accountability is very important. And, the transparency issue is more and more difficult in light of our social media platforms and the, many media platforms to do things, behind closed doors and in ways that could be done in the past and is not able to be successfully done I shouldn't say anymore, but perhaps much longer.
Yeah, thank you. I can see the significance then of Pope Francis, Laudato Si. I'm curious about the experience in Indonesia, particularly the Muslim participation in that process. It sounds like there have been some very positive results here recently.
Yes, indeed. And I was my last international trip. One of them was in Indonesia before the COVID took off, and there was the launch of the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative there beginning of last year. And it turns out that this rainforest and climate issue is an issue that allows all the faiths of that country to come together. It's something they can all agree on very, very strongly, very powerfly. And they've been very active. They're also launching, even during COVID, they've been launching local chapters, as I described, in the far-flung provinces with the highest rates of deforestation. So, they've also, the Muslim leaders have been able to declare fatwa, a kind of a religious edict against illegal logging, against illegal consumption and degradation of forests and forest animals. So they've been able to really exert quite a bit of religious, spiritual pressure on the adherents to do the right thing in terms of forests. And in that country also, the tension between indigenous peoples, like I think you were referring to, the tension has a chance of easing because there's a willingness to respect the spirituality of indigenous peoples for the first time. So that's encouraging. And then with Pope Francis, too, I had the honor of being with him in Puerto Maldonado in Peru in February 2018 when he visited the Amazon. He insisted on going straight to the Amazon, not stopping in any of the capitals. And there he was right in the Amazon with 4,000 indigenous peoples. And he honored them and he respected them in a way I couldn't have imagined would be possible. And it was a sea change moment there. And it's led to a lot of very positive results in action and awareness as well. So it's great to see the major world religions all moving in the same direction.
Yes, and I think this is the power of the religious leader,
right,
to be able to, generate those positive messages of honoring and respecting, the human being, and that we are humans and not property.
To Indonesia, I believe you can add Malaysia. They too, there has been a nexus. They are moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. The power of symbolic action. It's just really transformative. Obviously, there's pushback, though. One of the questions goes at this. What do we say? What do we who live in the economically privileged parts of the world say in response to those who say, well, it's our turn to have development that is fossil fuel based, leave us alone, or might say, it's our turn to have our share of beef, right? So McDonald's, et cetera. At one level, it's hard to argue with the injustice of the past and their complaint about that injustice, but I'm sure you've got more to say than that. So again, Charles, maybe we'll go to you first.
Yeah, I love that question. Well, interestingly, unfortunately, probably for the planet, is that energy from fossil fuel isn't good for anybody. It doesn't help anyone. They're all the air pollution, the externalities, not to mention climate change. But there's 100 reasons why staying with dirty fossil fuels is any good for anybody. So it's almost like I would say that yes, I would say that no, it's nobody's turn to be able to rely on fossil fuel. There are all kinds of alternatives that are becoming increasingly better. And beef isn't any good for human health either. All the studies are showing that yes, animal protein is contributing to all the comorbidities that have put people in harm's way for COVID, for example, heart disease, obesity, and so on. So yes, they may have a right to it, but I think the evidence is that neither of these things are any good for anybody. So let's offer healthy alternatives instead.
My income inequalities point was partly addressed to this, you see. Unless this is handled at the basic level, the root level of the tree, we won't be able to tackle these branches problems. Now, of course, the answer to this would be that the developed countries and the better societies, they would say, why should we suffer for the historical things? I think they also have a point. So my mind says that the answer to that is that UN should gradually be given own sources of funds. Now, for example, the deep oceans, or if you like, the planets, or the synchronous orbit, what prevents us from placing these things at the disposal of UN instead of countries fighting over these, and then gradually we can expand this sphere, you see. So without disturbing the status quo, without trying to pull down the developed countries, we should try to make a concerted effort through these resources by harnessing them to go for development of the needy, you see. That, I think that somehow, I don't know why that has not taken root.
Do I dare answer that question?
Yeah, I think they're.
Oftentimes, if we were to take an objective look at what's happening with these so-called developed countries, that seems to be full of impoverished people, conflict, and environmental degradation. And we really have to make the connection that how is it that these people who actually live in the most wealthy resource countries happen to also be some of the poorest and people who suffer from multiple, conflicts and all kinds of loss of the kinds of things that we take for granted in developed countries. So what is actually happening here? Does it make sense that people who live on the world's greatest resources also happen to be the poorest? There is something very wrong with that picture. And may I suggest that we examine how developed countries have taken it as a national security interest to secure their interests to the resources of these developing countries. It becomes national security policy. And again, we are dealing with policy issues, but it goes again to the power dynamics that we must examine. And the sad part about it is the messages that we put out, that we tend to our eleemosynary nature by giving money, aid, and then the donor fatigue. Oh, we just throw so many billions of dollars and there's no improvement. And this may I suggest that we also re-examine this kind of utter arrogance in our policies. But the truth of the matter is, the deeper question for us, how is it that people who are sitting on the world's wealthiest resources have to contend with environmental degradation, conflict in their countries, and experience so much poverty? And may I suggest that we examine as to whether or not their status may be intentionally created as part of an overall political interest and design. I'm not saying that that is the case, but I'm saying that it may be very good for us to examine those possibilities because it just does not make sense objectively.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if there's any additional comment on that. I'm mindful of the time, I have to admit, but I don't want to cut off any response on that point. All right, let's. So we're over time, as our participants no doubt are aware, as has become our custom in the last few webinars. We'll plan to go a few minutes over, but we're fast running to the end of that. So I think this is going to be the final question that we can pose, but it gives each of you maybe a chance to tie this all together. In reference to young people, I mean, look at us, folks. We're all of a certain age. We've been at this for a while. There's something to be said about bringing the wisdom of decades of service to this challenge. But I don't know if you have children. I do. I don't know if you have grandchildren. I do. That's where my heart is on this. What kind of world am I leaving? And what do I say to them? A message of hope, a message of realism, a message of regret. What do I say to them? What do I say to them to inspire them to carry on and to take this to the, a more successful level than we've managed to pull off in our lifetime? What's the message that we can leave then to the younger people? And I'm thinking of today's young adults who are just coming into leadership, but I'm also thinking of their children born now. And let me just end with that question. And each of you don't have to, but feel free to jump in and offer that reflection as a kind of closing comment.
Ron, if I may, it reminds me of an indigenous American Indian saying that when we use up these resources, we should remember and realize that we are borrowing from our grandchildren. I think if we can remember that, it'll probably help us a lot, you see. And secondly, I come back, unless I think we get rid of our nationalistic notions of the past few centuries, the world is now united through technology. You can't help it. Whether you like it or not, we have to lump it, you see. You can drive on the right side of the road in America, left side of the road in UK. But what do you do on the seas? What do you do in the air? There has to be one law, one set of rules, laws and attitudes, while respecting cultural traditions. But we need to move in this direction. We simply cannot afford. Business as usual is not a model that is practical. Satellites respect no boundaries. Simple.
Maybe I'll say a word so Audrey could finish, but just I really appreciate your point, and I'm clear that the future is with the young people in more ways than one, that the energy, the innovation, the fearlessness of young people is just so welcome in this space. And I think we're seeing more of that, even in the international debate, in the international fora. The young people are starting to exert themselves in a very strong way. And so I count on that. And I consider that my work and our work is really on their behalf and on behalf of their children too. So for our program, we're looking at a youth program in this next phase, which is starting this year. We will want to work very closely with the youth. We know that's the key to really successful outcomes. And for people who are interested, they may want to look at the website, the interfaithrainforest.org. www.interfaithrainforest.org is where you can find information and able to contact us if you're interested. But I'm clear that it's going to be the young people who turn the tide here, and we older ones can do the best we can. But they're going to come in, and the First Nations of the U.S. and Canada. There's a thinking 7 generations ahead. There's always an awareness of acting today with the interests of 7 generations ahead, and we need instilled in our Western concept, our Western culture, more of that kind of thinking, as Dr. Mustafa was alluding to.
Thank you so much. I really want to express my appreciation for this privilege and opportunity to be able to share today and to be in all of your presence. And, I really have enjoyed the conversation. And I would say that for all of the challenges in life, it is very important that we develop ourselves so that we can have the heart of compassion, love, kindness, and caring, and those values of what it means to be truly authentic. And, the legacy that we think of in life, is it the huge accumulations of wealth and the pride that comes with it? And, as my mother was leaving the body at age 99, I could see her doing her life review. What was important for her? She was saying, well, I think I did a good job as a mother. None of my children are in jail. I made sure you folks were educated so you could make your own way in life. You folks have become successful. You know how to take care of yourselves. And I'm sure she had many misgivings as well, but that she had raised us well, and she was a very strict mother. So it's those moments in life that give life great meaning. the relationships that you developed, the connections that you made that express the meaningfulness of life through the heart-to-heart connection. And if we have mastered the materiality, but we have not mastered this connection of the heart that allows us to be able to have that respect for each other and to honor the dignity of everyone's life and to recognize that each life is sacred. You know, Mother Teresa said, we cannot do great things, but we can do little things with great love. And always it is the power of that love that is going to be that power of transformation that will call us to come together and to get behind important initiatives that leave legacies that demonstrate the power of our love to care enough for future generations and for our earth and for all of life, because that is the ultimate expression of our legacy. Because as my spiritual mother said to me, God is love. And I firmly believe that the actualization of the living reality of the divine can be found here and now. For where we are is the holy ground, and we are ever in the ever-present eternal now in this moment, moment to moment. So thank you so much, everyone.
Amen.
Thank you. It's indeed been an honor to be in your presence in these little boxes, but your presence has come through with a powerful spiritual and personal touch. So thank you to Tariq Mustafa, to Charles Mcneil, and to Audrey Kitagawa for a really remarkable conversation. Thank you indeed.